Inflation just surged again, and it's hitting Americans harder than expected. Prices aren't just rising, they're rising faster than wages. The question is, how long can this go on? New inflation data just dropped, and it's worse than expected. The Consumer Price Index rose 3% in January, up from 2.9% in December, with a 0.5% increase just last month, the biggest monthly jump in over a year. The signs were there, but now the reality is hitting harder than anyone expected. Prices aren't just rising, they're accelerating, and the things people can't live without are leading the charge. Fuel costs more. Auto insurance is squeezing wallets tighter. And groceries? A simple carton of eggs has skyrocketed 15.2% in just 1 month, thanks to an avian flu outbreak wiping out supplies. Sure, some food prices, fruits, vegetables, cereal have ticked down slightly, but don't let that fool you. The overall cost of living is still climbing, and wages just aren't keeping up. Since 2021, prices have soared 20.7%, while paychecks have only grown 19.3%. That gap? That's the invisible force draining people's buying power, month after month. And here's the real problem. The Federal Reserve has been trying to push inflation down to 2%, but these numbers make it clear they're losing the battle. Bond yields have spiked to 4.6%, sending a clear message. Wall Street sees no relief in sight. Mortgage rates are now hovering near 7%, making homeownership feel like an impossible dream for anyone still trying to save. President Trump has called for immediate rate cuts, but the Federal Reserve isn't budging. They know inflation isn't done yet. It's clinging to the essentials: housing, energy, food, the things people have to buy, no matter how expensive they get. So now the real question isn't just when relief will come, but whether it ever truly will. Before we break this all down, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Economy Explorer. And don't skip a second, because this is information you need to hear. Is inflation really slowing down, or are we being lied to? They keep telling us inflation is cooling, that the worst is over, and that relief is on the way. But step into any grocery store, gas station, or rental office and tell me, does it feel like prices are coming down? Because what's actually happening isn't a return to normal, it's a new normal, where everything just stays expensive. The Consumer Price Index may have risen only 3% year over year, but that's on top of the insane price spikes of the last 2 years. This isn't inflation cooling. This is inflation settling in, refusing to leave. And here's what they don't want to admit. Inflation doesn't have to keep rising for it to keep hurting you. A loaf of bread that jumped from $2 to $4 doesn't need to hit $6 for you to feel the pain. If it stays at $4 forever, guess what? You're still paying double what you used to. That's the real trick behind this so-called slowdown. The economy doesn't need to be in free fall for you to struggle. It just needs to keep you stuck at this new, more expensive baseline. Meanwhile, essential costs aren't just staying high, they're climbing even more. Eggs skyrocketed 15.2% in a single month. Auto insurance rates have jumped at the fastest pace in decades. Gas, rent, utilities, nothing is truly getting cheaper. And yet, they keep pointing to slight dips in a few grocery items, like fruits and vegetables, as if that cancels out the fact that your paycheck still doesn't stretch as far as it used to. And let's talk about corporate greed, because while you're being told to just tighten your budget and ride this out, major corporations are posting record profits by keeping prices high even when their costs have gone down. They're holding prices hostage because they know that after years of inflation, we've been conditioned to accept this as normal. So when they tell you inflation is cooling, ask yourself, cooling for who? Because for the average American, the heat is still on full blast. If wages are rising, why are you still feeling broke? Every time new wage data comes out, the media jumps to celebrate. Wages are rising. Americans are making more than ever. But here's the reality they don't talk about. What good is a bigger paycheck if everything you buy costs even more? A slight increase in wages doesn't mean you're suddenly wealthier. It just means you're losing slightly slower. Since 2021, rent has exploded by 26%. Mortgage rates have climbed to 7%, pricing an entire generation out of home ownership. Auto loans are now at record highs, and the average new car payment? Over $700 a month. And don't even start on credit card debt, because thanks to rising interest rates, people are now paying over 20% interest just to keep up with basic expenses. Even if your paycheck went up 5%, how does that help when rent is up 26%? When gas, food, utilities, and healthcare have all risen faster than wages? The truth is, no matter how much more money people make, they're not actually gaining wealth, they're just treading water. That's why it feels like no matter how hard you work, you're still falling behind. And what's worse, this isn't temporary. We've been sold the idea that inflation is cooling and that things will go back to normal. But what if this is the new normal? What if wages continue to lag behind the cost of living for years to come? What if homeownership remains a distant dream, savings accounts stay empty, and debt keeps piling up? Because right now, that's exactly what's happening. The media can tell you wages are up. The government can say inflation is under control. But none of that matters if, at the end of the month, your bank account is still running on empty. Can the Federal Reserve stop inflation, or are they making it worse? The Federal Reserve has one job: control inflation. And for the past 2 years, they've been waging an all-out war to bring prices down, using their most powerful weapon, aggressive interest rate hikes. The goal? To crush demand, slow the economy, and force inflation back down to 2%. But here's the problem. It's not working. Inflation is still stuck at 3%. And instead of cooling down, the latest data shows prices are heating up again. That means one thing. The Fed isn't done tightening the screws. The central bank is now trapped in a high-stakes gamble. If they back off too soon, inflation could roar back to life, spiraling out of control like we saw in the 1970s. But if they keep rates too high for too long, they risk choking the economy into a full-blown recession. And right now, they're choosing the latter, leaving interest rates sky high and squeezing Americans even harder. And the cracks are already showing. Bond yields just spiked to 4.6%, a clear signal from Wall Street that investors don't believe inflation is under control. Mortgage rates are hovering near 7%, keeping millions locked out of homeownership. Credit card interest rates are now above 20%, making even basic purchases a financial trap for people trying to stay afloat. And with borrowing more expensive than ever, businesses are cutting back, job growth is slowing, and layoffs are creeping higher. This isn't just a rate hike strategy, it's an economic stranglehold. But here's the part they don't want to admit. Raising interest rates doesn't fix the kind of inflation we're seeing. The Fed's tools work when inflation is driven by too much spending, but this inflation isn't just about consumer demand. It's fueled by corporate greed, supply chain disruptions, energy prices, and global instability, things higher interest rates can't fix. Yet, instead of addressing these root causes, the Fed is punishing everyday people, making homeownership, debt, and even survival more expensive. So we have to ask, is the Fed really fighting inflation, or are they just making life harder for the people who can least afford it? Trump wants rate cuts, but will the Fed listen? President Trump has made it clear he wants interest rate cuts now. He's calling out the Fed, arguing that high borrowing costs are choking the economy and stalling growth. But the Federal Reserve isn't budging. Why? Because they fear cutting rates too soon could cause inflation to spiral out of control again. It's a high-stakes standoff, one that could determine whether the U.S. faces another economic boom or a deep recession. And here's the real dilemma. Not all inflation is the same. The Fed's usual strategy of hiking interest rates works when inflation is caused by too much consumer demand. But right now, that's not what's happening. Much of the price increases we're seeing today are driven by external factors, like energy prices, supply chain shocks, and corporate price hikes. Interest rate hikes don't stop big corporations from keeping prices high, but they do make it harder for average Americans to afford homes, pay off debt, and keep their businesses running. And yet, the Fed seems unwilling to pivot. Their fear that cutting rates too soon could unleash another wave of inflation, and once that happens, it's even harder to bring back under control. But waiting too long could slam the brakes on the economy completely, sending businesses into panic mode and triggering mass layoffs. So now we're stuck. Trump wants relief, the Fed wants control, and Americans? They just want prices to stop crushing their wallets. The question is, how long will the Fed keep the country in a financial chokehold before they finally make a move? And when they do, will it be too little, too late? How long until you finally feel relief? This is the question everyone is asking, but no one seems to have a real answer. Inflation may not be skyrocketing like it was in 2022, but let's be honest. Does life feel any easier? Because for millions of Americans, it doesn't. Food prices are still painfully high, rent has locked in at record-breaking levels, and gas, utilities, and insurance continue chipping away at people's paychecks every single month. The cost of living isn't just rising, it's trapping people in a cycle where no matter how much they work, they're still falling behind. And if you're waiting for relief, here's the harsh reality. It may never come the way we expect. The Federal Reserve is refusing to cut interest rates anytime soon, which means borrowing will stay expensive, mortgage rates will remain out of reach for millions, and credit card debt will keep spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, markets are reacting like inflation isn't going anywhere. The bond market is sending signals that rates might stay high for much longer than people hoped, and businesses aren't dropping their prices because they've already gotten people used to paying more. So we have to ask, is this the new normal? Is this just how the economy is going to function from now on? Because if the cost of living doesn't come down and wages don't catch up, what does that mean for the future? How long before homeownership feels like a luxury only the wealthy can afford? How long before saving for the future becomes impossible? How long before the American dream is nothing more than a story we tell about the past? But the biggest question isn't when relief will come. It's whether it ever truly will. If this video helped you understand what's really going on with the economy, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Economy Explorer, because we break down the truth, not just the headlines. And if you're ready to go deeper, click on one of the suggested videos on the screen right now. Thank you for being part of our channel, and remember, staying informed is the first step to staying ahead.